Hello everyone and welcome back to Gods and Myths of Northern Europe. Part 7. Now my little PowerCats, let's read about the giants and the dwarfs, and the theft of the apples. Okay. In the second section of this book, Gangleri has disappeared and Snorri fills out his outline by adding more stories about the gods, which will serve to explain some of the imagery used by poets. Nearly all of the stories which he includes in the poetic diction have to do with attempts by the giants to get the better of the gods and to steal their treasures. The theft of the apples. First we hear about the theft of the apples of youth. One day when three of the gods, Odin, Loki, and Honir, were journeying together, they tried to roast an ox for their dinner, but the meat would not cook. At last a mighty eagle in an oak called out to them from above and offered to get the meal cooked for them, if they would give him a share. It turned out that his idea of a fair share meant the greater part of the ox, and Loki in rage attacked him with a stick. He was caught up with the stick and carried through the air, and the eagle refused to let him go until he promised to bring him Idun and her golden apples. When Loki returned to Asgard, it was easy to lure Idun outside on some pretext, and the giant Thiazi, still in his eagle form, bore her off to his home. Without the apples of youth, the Aesir began to grow gray and wrinkled, and at last Loki's guilt was discovered, and he was threatened with death unless he righted the wrong that he had done. Accordingly, he borrowed the falcon shape of Freya and flew off to Thiazi's abode. The giant was out fishing, so Loki changed Idun into a nut and flew off with it in his claws. Thiazi discovered this loss and started in pursuit. Loki flew into Asgard only just in time. The gods were waiting with a heap of wood shavings, and they set to fire these as soon as Loki had flown over the wall, so that the fire singed Thiazi's wings, and he fell down inside the stronghold of the gods, and was easily slain. His daughter Scotty came to avenge her father, and the gods offered her marriage with one of them as compensation for the slaying. She was permitted to see no more than their feet when she made her choice. So it came about that she married Njord, thinking that she was choosing the handsome Balder. Odin also pleased her by throwing Thiazi's eyes into the heaven, where they became stars. The winning of the Mead. Next we hear of the truce made between the Aesir and the Vanir, and how this led to the gift of inspiration coming to gods and men. When the two companies of gods met to make peace, they took a vessel and all spat into it. From the contents they created the wise Kvasir, who was able to answer all questions. Kvasir, however, was killed by two dwarfs, who let his blood run to 3 huge vessels, and mixed it with honey to make it rich mead. However, whoever drank of this received the gift of inspiration and could compose poetry and utter words of wisdom. The malicious dwarfs, however, went too far when they killed a giant called Gilling, and his wife as well. The giant's son, Suttung, took vengeance on them by putting them on a rock and leaving them there to drown. To save their lives, they were forced to give him the mead. It was for this reason that poetry is called Kvasir's blood, or ship of the dwarves. The gods wished to win the precious liquid back from the giants, and Odin set out to do so. First he sharpened the scythes of 9 men laboring in the fields to such good effect that in the end they quarreled over the possession of his wonderful whetstone, and cut one another's throats. Then he took their place, and hired himself out to their master, the Giant Biagi, who was Suttung's brother. The only which he demanded was a drink of the wonderful mead. Biagi agreed to this, but when it came to the point, his brother would not let Odin have his drink. Then Odin persuaded Biagi to help him to bore a hole into the mountain where Suttung lived, and crept in, taking the form of a serpent. He slept there 3 nights with Suttung's daughter, and persuaded her to give him 3 drinks of the mead. In 3 draughts he emptied all 3 vessels, and flew off in eagle form back to the Aesir, who had more vessels ready for him. He spat out the mead into them, and all but a little that had been lost on the way, known as the poeter's share, and so it came about that poetry is now said to be the gift of Odin and easier to men. Thors Duel. Another tale is that of the giant Hrungnir's duel with Thor. Odin and Hrungnir had a wager together, each insisting that he had the finer horse. Odin galloped off on Sleipnir, and Hrungnir after him on his horse Goldmane, and Hrungnir inadvertently found himself inside the realm of the gods before he drew rein. The Aesir allowed him to drink from Thor's great beakers, and he grew boastful, declaring that he was going to sink Asgard to the sea and carry off Freya and Sif. Thor at this point came in, fiercely demanding why a giant was sitting drinking among them, but Hrungnir claimed safe conduct, and challenged Thor to a duel. For this duel, the giants made a clay man, called Mistcalf, to support Hrungnir. Hrungnir himself had a sharp three-cornered heart of stone, and a stone head, and he was armed with a stone shield and whetstone. Thor came out with Thialfi to meet him, and Thialfi told the giant he had better stand on his shield in case Thor attacked him from below. Then Thor bore down on Hrungnir with thunder and lightning, and hurled his hammer at him. While the giant threw his whetstone, the weapons met in midair, and the whetstone was shattered, but one piece lodged in Thor's forehead. The hammer went on to strike Hunger's skull and break it to pieces. Meanwhile, Thialfi had dealt with the clay figure without much difficulty. The only problem was caused by Hrungnir falling on top of Thor, for no one could move his great leg off the god until Thor's little son Magni came up and pushed it away. Magni received a horse Goldmane as a reward. Aesir's tried to sing spells to get the pieces of whetstone out of Thor's head, but he began to tell her how he had once carried her husband, Aronvendil, in a basket out of Giant Land, and when one toe of Aronville had frozen, he had flung it up into the sky to become the star called Aronville's toe. She was so interested that the spell was never finished, so the stone still remains in Thor's head. Thor's visit to Gerard. Another tale about Thor tells of his expedition to the realm of Gerard. Loki had again been out flying in Freya's feather shape, and he was captured in the hall of Gerard by the giant himself. Gerard recognized the hawk by its eyes, and knew it to be Loki, so he shut him up and starved him for 3 months, until he promised to bring Thor to the hall without his hammer, or belt of strength. Loki succeeded in this, but on the way Thor was warned of his danger by a friendly giantess, who lent him her magic staff, another belt, and iron gloves. First Thor was nearly drowned in the river Vimir, for Geirrod's daughter stood astride the stream making it swell, until he struck her with a huge rock. He then climbed out with aid of a rowan tree. Then he entered Geirrod's hall and sat down on a seat, but at once felt himself being raised to the roof. He forced the seat down with the aid of his magic staff, and so broke the backs of Geirrod's 2 daughters, who had been pushing up his chair. He then went up to Gerard, who flung a ball of hot iron at him. Thor caught it with his iron gloves, and while Gerard ducked behind a pillar, he hurled it through the pillar and the giant together. So Thor went back unscathed to Asgard. The treasures of the gods. There's also the story of how the gods obtained their wonderful treasures. One day in a fit of mischief, Loki cut off Sif's golden hair, and Thor would have killed him if he had not found 2 cunning dwarfs to make new tresses of real gold for Sif, which would grow like natural hair. They also made Frey's wonderful ship and Odin's great spear Gungnir. Loki then challenged 2 other skillful dwarfs to make 3 more treasures as good as these, wagering his head that they would not succeed. As they labored in the smithy, the dwarf working the bellows was stung persistently by a fly, but in spite of this, they succeeded in forging a marvelous boar with bristles of gold, which could run faster than any steed and light up the darkest night. They also forged the great gold ring Draupnir, from which 8 other rings dropped every 9th night. As they were making the 3rd treasure, the fly stung the dwarf again, this time on his eyelid, and he had to raise his hand to brush it away. The 3rd treasure was the great hammer Mjolnir, which would hit anything at which it was thrown, and return to the thrower's hand. Because of the interference of the fly, however, which was Loki in disguise, it was a little short in handle. Nevertheless, the gods held that the hammer was the best of all the treasures, and sure weapon against their enemies, and they declared that Loki had lost his wager. He ran away only to be caught by Thor and handed over to the dwarfs. They wanted to cut off his head, but Loki argued that they had no right to touch his neck. So in the end, they contented themselves by sewing up his lips. Okay, that is 10 minutes, and we will continue with the Ransom of Otter. So, my lovely PowerCats, if you are interested, check out my social media down below. I finally figured out how to post links, and if you come from YouTube, let me know. I'll be happy to talk to you. See you Saturday and Sunday when I continue Sears Isle with Vera audio, hopefully. See you soon.